In the autumn of 1898, miners at a remote West Virginia coal operation broke through a wall of rock that shouldn't have been there and found a cavern that had been sealed longer than anything with a backbone had walked these mountains. The men who went into that space came back out changed. They said they heard their own voices calling their names from deeper in the dark, using words they'd never spoken, asking them to come further. Within a week, every man in that hollow refused to go back underground. What the company did next is the part that was never supposed to get out. There's a kind of place in West Virginia where the railroad stops being a road and starts being a seam that cuts through the mountain like a wound that never healed. And the coal towns in the southern counties in the 1890s weren't really towns at all, but operations that existed because the coal existed. When the coal ran out, the towns would run out too, and everyone who lived there understood that even if nobody said it out loud. Blacklick Hollow sat in a fold between two ridges in the southern part of the state, the kind of place where the sun didn't reach the valley floor until nearly 10 in the morning and left again by 3 in the afternoon. The C&O Railroad had punched a line through there in the 1880s, and the company that owned the mine had built the town around the tracks, like a body built around a spine. The company store sat at the center of the hollow, a 2-story wooden building with a porch that ran the full width, and everything a miner's family needed came through that store at prices that were higher than they should have been. The company paid you in scrip, tokens stamped with the mine's name that only worked at the company store, and the store charged what it wanted because there was nowhere else to go, which was how the whole thing was designed to work from the start. The houses lined up along the creek in rows that were identical, the same weathered clapboard, the same crooked porch, the same thin walls that let the winter come straight through. Up on the hill above the hollow, the superintendent lived in a house with 10 rooms and a fenced yard and trees that someone had planted on purpose, while the miners lived below, and below them, closer to the drift mouth where the mine opened into the hillside, the company had put the boarding houses for the black miners and the immigrants from Hungary and Italy and Poland. The housing told you everything about who you were and where you stood, and you didn't move up unless the company decided you could. The mine itself ran into the mountain on 3 main slopes, with 7 working seams that the crews had been picking and blasting for nearly a decade. The coal was bituminous, the kind that burned hot and dark, and there was still plenty of it in the upper seams, but the veins were getting thinner, and the company kept pushing for more because that was the nature of the thing. A coal operation in 1898 wasn't just a hole in the ground, but a machine made of men and mules and black powder, and the ventilating furnace that burned at the bottom of the shaft to pull fresh air through the tunnels, and every part of that machine existed to get coal out of the mountain and onto the rail cars as fast as it could go. The men who worked those seams came in before daylight and left after dark, swinging picks into the coal face by the light of small lamps fixed to their caps, loading the coal into carts that the mules pulled along the rails to the shaft, while the loaded carts went up and the empty ones came back down, and this went on 6 days a week until the men's hands went numb and their lungs filled with dust that they coughed up onto the ground outside the drift mouth every morning before they went back in. Nobody asked questions about what was inside the mountain, because the mountain was where the coal was, and the coal was what kept the hollow alive, and that was enough. But the mountain had been holding something else too, something below the coal, and below the seams, and below the reach of any pick or blast. And in the fall of 1898, the company told the men to dig deeper than anyone had ever dug there before. That was when it stopped being enough. The 7th seam was running thin by the fall of 1898, and the superintendent had been pushing the foreman to open a new working deeper in the mountain for months because the geology reports, such as they were, suggested there might be another seam further down below the levels the crews had been working. In October, a crew of 12 men started blasting into a section of rock at the lowest level of the mine, beyond the air course that the ventilating furnace fed, where the tunnels narrowed and the temperature dropped and the darkness took on a different density. The rock they were cutting through wasn't coal-bearing, and the miners knew this by feel because coal rock has a give to it, a softness under the pick that tells you you're getting close to the seam. This rock was hard and dense and smooth, the kind of stone that made the pick ring and the arms burn after a few swings. The men complained and the foreman told them to keep going, and the company didn't send a geologist down because coal companies in 1898 didn't send geologists anywhere. They sent foremen with instructions to keep the coal coming, and that was the extent of the science they applied to the earth. It took 3 days of blasting and picking before the wall gave way. When a miner named Harlan Creel drove his pick into a crack in the rock at the end of the tunnel, and the crack split open, and the pick went through into nothing, not into softer rock, but into an emptiness so complete that the sound of the pick hitting the far side never came back, or came back so changed by the distance that it didn't sound like a pick at all. It sounded like a cough, or a word spoken in a language nobody recognized. The air that came through the opening was cold, not mine cold, which is a steady coolness that you get used to, but a deeper cold, the kind you feel in your sternum before you feel it on your skin. It carried no smell of sulfur, no gas, no coal dust, no furnace smoke, and it smelled like nothing, like air that had been sealed inside rock for so long that it had forgotten what the surface of the world was. When the foreman held his lamp into the opening, the light went in and didn't come back the same way, and what it illuminated on the nearest wall of the cavern stopped the men cold. The wall was smooth in places, not carved smooth, but worn smooth, the way water wears stone over thousands of years. But there was no water in this cavern, because the floor was dry and the walls were dry. The formations that hung from the ceiling and rose from the floor looked like stalactites and stalagmites, the kind you'd find in any limestone cave, but the stone was harder than limestone, and the colors were wrong, not the white and cream of cave formations, but something darker, streaked with mineral lines that didn't correspond to anything the miners had seen underground in a decade of working the mountain. Harlan Creel took a step into the cavern and stopped, and he said later that the silence in that space was unlike anything he'd ever heard, even though he'd spent his whole life in mines where silence usually meant something was about to collapse. This wasn't that kind of silence, but the silence of a room that had been closed for a very long time, and had just had the door opened, and the air in the cavern seemed to press against him, not pushing him out, but acknowledging that he was there, the way a sleeping animal acknowledges a sound without waking up. The foreman ordered the men to pull back, and they sealed the opening with timber and canvas and went back up the shaft. And that night, in the company store and on the porches of the clapboard houses, the men talked about what they'd found. The older miners, the ones who'd grown up in these mountains before the companies came, listened and said nothing, because they knew that some things that come out of the ground were not meant to be found. The superintendent came down the next morning and looked at the sealed opening and told the foreman to open it back up and send a crew in to take measurements, to see if there was coal beneath the cavern floor or if the whole thing was just a void that would need to be worked around. He was not a man who believed in anything he couldn't ship on a rail car, so the cavern was a geological curiosity and nothing more, and the sooner the men got back to work, the sooner the eighth seam would start producing. The crew that went in that day was smaller, 6 men instead of 12, and they went in with lamps and a measuring chain and instructions to map the extent of the cavern and come back out. But they didn't get far before Harlan Creel stopped walking and stood perfectly still in the dark with his lamp held at his side, and his head tilted like a dog hearing something from the next ridge. He heard his name called the way someone calls you from the next room when they need you for something ordinary. Not shouted and not whispered, but spoken in a calm and conversational voice that said, "Harlan." And it was his voice, his own voice, coming from somewhere deeper in the cavern, from a direction he couldn't pin down because the space was too large and the walls were too far away, and the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. He turned to the man beside him and asked if he'd heard it, and before the other man could answer, his own name came out of the dark, Marcus, spoken in the second miner's voice from a different direction than the first. Then a third name and a fourth, each one in the voice of the man it belonged to, each one coming from a different point in the darkness, until all 6 men were standing in a loose circle in the cavern with their lamps raised, listening to their own names being spoken by their own mouths from the depths of a space that had been sealed since before the mountains wore down. They went back up and told the foreman what they'd heard, and the foreman told the superintendent, and the superintendent said it was echoes from the ventilating furnace. that the draft was carrying sounds through the rock, that the men were tired and the darkness was playing tricks, and he told them to go back down in the morning. But the story had already spread through the hollow by then, moving the way stories move in company towns, not through the official channels, but through the kitchens and the porches and the church steps. And the older hands, the men who'd spent their whole lives underground and knew the Tommyknocker stories by heart, went quiet when they heard the details. They knew about Tommyknockers because every miner in Appalachia knew about them, the little people in the walls who knocked before a cave-in to warn you to get out. The knockers were part of the mine the way the dust and the gas were part of the mine, and you respected them, and you left the last bite of your pasty for them, and you didn't talk about it outside because outsiders wouldn't understand. But the knockers knocked, and that was what they did, and if you were smart, you listened and you got out, because this wasn't knocking but speaking, and 6 men had heard 6 names and 6 voices from a cavern that had been closed since before the coal formed. The knockers didn't speak and they didn't know your name, and whether they were the spirits of dead miners or small creatures that lived in the rock, or just the sound of the earth shifting before a collapse, they knocked. They didn't call you by your name in your own voice and ask you to come further in. The next shift went down anyway because you went down or you lost your house and your credit, and your family's place in the hollow, which was the system the scrip and the company store and the company houses were designed to maintain. They kept you going into the mountain even when you didn't want to, because the alternative was having nothing and being nowhere, and a man with a family can't afford that. The next crew heard the names too, and this time the voices said more than names because they said sentences. Fragments of words strung together that sounded like conversations the miners had had that day, but with words mixed in that the miners didn't know and phrases that didn't make sense. And at the end of each string of words, always, the same invitation, spoken gently in the listener's own voice. Come further in, come further in. The company ordered the crew to keep working the 8th seam, and the crew kept working because the alternative was eviction and the loss of scrip credit that their families needed to eat. And so the men went deeper into the cavern, and the cavern went deeper into the mountain, and the voices went deeper into the men. The formations changed as they moved further from the opening, where the stalactites that had looked like ordinary cave formations near the entrance became stranger the deeper they went, and the columns of stone that rose from the floor were thicker and more irregular, with mineral lines that ran in patterns that didn't follow the natural layering of the rock. A miner named Ellis Carpenter, who'd explored wild caves in the mountains since he was a boy, said the formations were wrong in a way he couldn't exactly name, because they looked like cave formations but the scale was off, and the stone was harder than it should have been, harder than limestone, harder than sandstone, almost as hard as the pick heads they were carrying, and the colors, those dark streaks running through the pale stone, didn't match any mineral he'd seen in 20 years of working underground. Another miner, a man named Judson Hale, who had some schooling in geology before he came to work the coal, studied the rock layer they'd broken through to enter the cavern and explained it to the others in the quiet way men explain things underground, with their lamps held low and their voices kept to a murmur. The rock above the cavern was the same strata that held the coal seams, but the rock below was older, much older, because the coal seams formed from plants and trees and living things that died and were buried and compressed over millions of years, while this cavern was below the coal, below the layer of life, which meant the cavern had existed before the coal formed, before the forests that became the coal had even grown. The stone around the cavern was older than the coal, older than the plants that made the coal, older than the soil the plants grew in, and this space had been sealed inside the mountain when the Appalachian peaks were still as tall as the Alps, sealed there ever since, waiting under layers of rock and time while the mountains wore down, and the oceans retreated, and the first things that could walk crept out of the water and onto the land above. The men stood in that knowledge the way you stand in cold water, feeling it rise, because this wasn't a cave that had formed after the mountain, but something that had been there before the mountain was a mountain, before the coal was coal, before the living things that became the coal had even existed, and whatever had made this space had been alone in the dark for a span of time that no human mind could hold. Then they found the marks on the walls, and these weren't natural erosion or mining tool marks or drill holes or the grooves a pick makes when it bites into stone, but notches and channels cut into the walls in patterns that repeated without following any system the men recognized. The cuts were precise and deep, and they'd been made in stone that was too hard for any tool the miners had ever seen. And the patterns weren't decorative in any way that made sense to eyes that expected decoration, but functional, like writing, or like the grooves on a machine part that fit into another part you couldn't see. And whatever had made these marks had done it in stone that had been sealed away from the surface before anything with hands had existed to make marks with. The voices grew louder the deeper they went, and more specific, with multiple miners hearing multiple voices simultaneously, their own voices layered on top of each other, having conversations that the miners above ground had never had, about things the miners had never discussed, using words some of the miners didn't know, as if the cavern had learned their voices and was trying them out, combining them in new ways, building conversations out of the sounds of the men who'd broken through the wall. And then one of the miners sat down, a young man named Tomlin, barely 20, strong enough to swing a pick all day and come home to eat dinner with his wife, and he sat down on the floor of the cavern, with his back against one of the stone columns, and his lamp between his knees, and he wouldn't move. When the other men pulled at his arms, he looked up at them with eyes that were there and not there, the way a man's eyes look when he's listening to something you can't hear, and he said that his voice was asking him to come further in, that it sounded like he was already down there, somewhere deeper, waiting for himself to arrive. They pulled him to his feet and half carried him out of the cavern, and up the shaft and into the daylight, where he stood blinking on the porch of the company store for a long time, and didn't speak again for 3 days. The crew went back up without mapping the full extent of the cavern, and the foreman reported to the superintendent that the space was too large to measure and that the men were refusing to continue. The superintendent came down from his house on the hill the next morning and stood in front of the drift mouth and told the assembled miners that the cavern was a natural void, and the echoes were caused by the ventilating furnace draft moving through a confined space, and that any man who refused to work the 8th seam would be fired, evicted from his company house, and have his script credit canceled at the store. He said this the way men in his position said things in 1898, which is to say he said it once, and he didn't say it again, because he didn't need to, since the threat was enough, and the system was built to make the threat enough. For a few days it was enough, and men went back down and stood at the entrance to the cavern with their lamps and their picks, and they could hear the voices before they even stepped inside, their own names being called from the dark, their own words being rearranged into sentences they'd never spoken, and at the end of each sentence, always that gentle invitation. Some of the men stepped in anyway, because the alternative was losing their house and their food and their place in the hollow, and they came back out looking the way Tomlin had looked, distant and hollow-eyed, as if part of them had stayed in the cavern and the rest was just walking. The changes in the men were small at first, the way changes are when something is taking hold of a person from the inside. They stopped talking during the shift change, and they ate dinner with their families, but didn't say much, and one man's wife told the foreman's wife that her husband had started standing at the window after the children were asleep, facing the mountain, not moving, not doing anything, just standing there with his eyes open. Another man stopped sleeping altogether and sat in a chair by the stove rocking back and forth, and when his wife asked him what was wrong, he said he could hear his own voice from the mountain calling him, even up here, even inside the house, even when the mine was closed and the shaft was sealed and there was no possible way for sound to travel that far. The breaking point came on a Thursday when the men gathered in the church at the edge of the hollow, the one building in the town that the company had built but didn't own in the way it owned everything else. And that Thursday night the church was full with every man who worked the mine, and some of the women too, standing in the back with their arms folded, listening. The oldest miner in the hollow was a man named Amos Venable, 63 years old, which was old enough in 1898 to be considered a man who had lived more than his share of life. And he'd been working Appalachian mines since before the railroads came, and he'd seen cave-ins and explosions and men carried out in blankets, and he'd heard tommyknockers knocking in the walls more times than he could count, and he knew the sounds that a mine makes when it's about to take your life, and the sounds it makes when it's just being a mine. He stood up in that church and he didn't make a speech. He said one thing, which was that they weren't going back down. Nobody argued because nobody needed to, and nobody said they should go back or that they'd lose their houses, or that the company would blacklist them from every mine in the state because they already knew all of that before they walked into the church. The question wasn't whether they could afford to stop working, but whether they could afford to keep going, and every man in that room already knew the answer. The company brought in replacement workers from the next county the following week, men who'd never heard the stories, men who needed jobs and didn't ask questions about why a whole crew had walked out. But the local men stood at the drift mouth when the new workers arrived and told them what they'd heard in the cavern, the voices and the names and the marks on the walls, and the young man named Tomlin who'd sat down in the dark and said that he was already down there waiting for himself. The new workers listened and looked at the faces of the men telling the story, and turned around and went back to the next county without going in. The company threatened eviction with written notices to every house in the hollow, giving 1 week to vacate or go back to work, and they threatened to call the state militia, as they'd done before in West Virginia, when miners refused to cooperate, and everyone remembered the Hawk's Nest strike of 1880, when the militia had come, and the strike had been broken by soldiers with rifles. They threatened to blacklist every man in the hollow from working any mine in the state, which was a sentence to poverty and exile, and a kind of death that didn't require a grave. The miners held, and not one man crossed the line, because what was waiting for them in that cavern was worse than eviction, worse than blacklisting, worse than anything the company could do to them above ground. What was down there would take more than their jobs, because it would take the part of them that was still them and leave something standing in their place that wore their voice and used their name and walked up out of the mountain wearing their face, and that was a thing you couldn't come back from, no matter how much script the company gave you. The company couldn't force the men back after they'd tried threats and eviction notices and replacement workers and the promise of militia, because the thing the men were afraid of was bigger than the thing the company could do to them, and a man who believes a mountain is calling his name in his own voice is not afraid of losing his job, but of losing himself. After 2 weeks of failing to get a single man down that shaft, the company made a different kind of decision. The crew arrived without warning on a Monday morning, and they weren't miners, but laborers brought in from outside the county, men who didn't know what was inside the mountain and didn't ask, and they came with wagon loads of stone and timber and bags of mortar. They went down the shaft and they built a wall across the entrance to the 8th seam, and this wasn't a timber brace or a temporary closure, but a permanent seal of stone and mortar laid thick enough to hold back the mountain, thick enough that no one could break through it without a crew and a week of work. The miners watched from the ridge above the drift mouth, sitting on the hillside in the cold autumn morning, and watching the wagons go in, and the men go down, and the sounds of construction come up the shaft, and they said nothing because they understood what was happening. The company wasn't protecting the miners from a cave-in, but protecting itself from what the miners might say if the story got out, because a mine where men heard their own voices calling from the dark was a mine that no one would work, and a mine that no one would work produced nothing, and a mine that produced nothing was a mine that the railroad would stop shipping from, and the investors would stop funding. And in the world of coal operations in 1898, losing money was the only sin that mattered. The official report filed with the state mine inspector said that the 8th seam had experienced a cave-in and was sealed for safety, but there had been no cave-in. The walls of the cavern were intact, the formations were intact, the marks on the walls were intact, and the voices were intact, calling from the dark, waiting for someone to break through the wall again and come further in. The state inspector never went down to check, and that was how it worked in West Virginia in 1898, where the company filed the report and the state accepted it because the state had 4 mine inspection districts, covering a landscape of mountains and hollows, and the inspector had more mines than he could visit, and the company's word was the only record that existed. The men who'd told the story outside the hollow, the ones who'd talked to the replacement workers, the ones who'd stood at the drift mouth and warned the new men away. Those men paid a price for doing the right thing. Some were evicted from their houses that week, with their belongings set on the road outside the company store, and their children watching from the porch of the school, while their parents carried mattresses and chairs and kitchen pots to whatever shelter they could find. Some were quietly paid off, handed cash and told to leave the county and not come back, and they took the money because it was more than they'd ever held at one time, and because leaving was better than staying in a hollow where the company owned the walls and the floors and the air you breathed. Others were blacklisted with their names circulated among the mine operators in the southern counties, and every door they knocked on after that was closed before they could say why they were there. The company town gradually emptied as new workers were brought in who'd never heard the stories, families from other parts of the state and immigrants fresh off the trains. And they moved into the houses that the old miners had left, and they worked the seams that were still producing, and nobody told them about the cavern behind the wall, or the voices that still called from the dark on the other side of the stone. The company had decided that the story didn't exist, and in a company town, the company decided what existed and what didn't, so the wall held and the report held and the silence held, and the thing inside the mountain held too, patient and voiceless behind the stone, calling names that no one above ground could hear anymore. But the thing about walls is that they work both ways, because they keep something in, but they also keep the knowledge of what's behind them alive, since a wall is a statement that says there is something on the other side that we needed to stop. The years after 1898 changed the hollow the way years change every place, slowly and then all at once, and the mine changed names twice in the first decade as it was absorbed by a larger company that operated 3 other mines in the county, and the new company didn't keep records about the sealed seam because there was nothing in the records worth keeping. The concrete wall at the 8th seam was buried under slag from the upper workings, and the slag was buried under kudzu and scrub pine, and the entrance to the cavern disappeared into the hillside the way things disappear in West Virginia, gradually and then completely. The men who'd been evicted scattered across the southern counties, and some found work in other mines and some didn't. But the ones who took the payoff money and left the county carried the story with them the way you carry something you can't put down. They told it in the places they went, in the boarding houses and the church basements, and the yards of other company towns where men understood what it meant to hear something from the mountain that shouldn't be speaking, and the story traveled along the same routes the coal traveled, down the valleys and along the creeks, and over the ridges into the next hollow and the next, and it changed a little each time it moved, the way stories do, but the core stayed the same. Men heard their own names called from the dark, the voices spoke in words the men had never said, and the company sealed the mine and lied about it, and that was what survived. In some tellings, the voices became ghosts, the miners who died in the explosions of the 1880s and 1890s, the ones whose spirits the Tommyknockers were supposed to be, and those miners had found a different place to wait, a cavern deeper than any seam, and they were calling the living down to join them. In other tellings, the cavern was older than death, older than the idea of dying, and whatever was inside had never been alive and didn't understand what living meant, but it could mimic the sounds of the living because it had been listening through the rock for a very long time. The miners in later decades who heard the story made a distinction that mattered, because they said it wasn't knockers, and the knockers knocked to warn you, because the spirits of dead miners wanted you to get out, wanted you to avoid the fate they'd suffered, and the knockers were on your side even if they frightened you. Whatever was in the Blacklick cavern wasn't warning anyone but inviting them in, and the distinction between a warning and an invitation might not seem like much when you're standing in the dark, listening to your own voice say your name, but to men who worked underground, it was the difference between a friend and something else entirely. The sealed mine is still there if you know where to look, even though the company that built the wall dissolved in the 1920s, absorbed into one of the large corporations that came to dominate the West Virginia coal industry by the end of the century. The town above the mine is gone now. The clapboard houses collapsed or burned or carried away. The company store a foundation outline in the kudzu. The superintendent's house on the hill nothing but a chimney standing in a clearing. The concrete structure that covers the sealed entrance is overgrown and half buried in hillside, and if you brush the dirt and vines away, you can see the stone and mortar the laborers laid on that Monday morning in 1898, with no historical marker, no mine safety bulletin, and no record in the county courthouse beyond a single line in the state inspector's report that says the 8th seam was closed due to cave-in. The mountain doesn't volunteer information, which is one of the first things you learn if you grow up in these hollows, because the mountains keep what they keep, and they don't explain themselves, and the people who live in their shadow learn to listen without asking. The story of the voices in the cavern survived not because anyone wrote it down, but because the people who heard it couldn't stop thinking about it, and they passed it to their children, and their children passed it to theirs, and the story kept breathing long after the company that tried to bury it had turned to dust. Which is the thing about burying something, because you have to stay to make sure it stays buried, and companies don't stay, they move on, they dissolve, they get absorbed by larger companies that don't know what the smaller company hid, but the mountain stays, and the people who live in the mountain's shadow, they stay too, and they remember what the companies would rather they forgot. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest on Earth, and they were ancient when the coal formed from the compressed remains of forests that grew 300 million years ago, and they were ancient before that, born from collisions in the Earth's crust that thrust rock upward into peaks that once stood as high as the Himalayas, before time and weather wore those peaks down into the rounded ridges and deep hollows that exist today. The Appalachians have been standing for so long that the stone itself has a kind of memory, not the memory of a mind, but the memory of a place that has held things inside it for longer than any living thing can comprehend. Something that old doesn't hold things the way a vault holds them, but the way a house holds the smell of cooking after the kitchen is empty, the way a room holds the shape of a voice after the person who spoke has gone. The rock in these mountains has been absorbing vibrations since before there were ears to hear them, and the miners who broke through into that cavern in 1898 opened a door into a space where those vibrations hadn't been touched by surface air since before the first creature crawled out of the sea and felt the sun on its back. The voices the miners heard, their own names in their own voices, speaking words they'd never said, might have been echoes of a kind that doesn't exist anywhere else on the surface. The marks on the walls might have been made by something that existed before the concept of making existed, and that gentle call to come further in might have been the sound of a place that had been waiting for a very long time finally being noticed by someone from above. Or it might have been something else, because the story doesn't say, and the men who lived it didn't know, and the people who passed it down didn't pretend to know, and the mountain isn't telling. What the story does say is that the company made a decision, and they didn't investigate, and they didn't send anyone into the cavern to document what was there. But they built a wall and filed a false report and evicted the witnesses and moved in new families. And they did it because a mind that speaks to you in your own voice is a mind that no one will work. And a mind that no one will work is a mind that doesn't make money. And a mind that doesn't make money is a problem that solves itself if you bury it deep enough. The cover-up worked for as long as it needed to, and the company got its coal from the upper seams for another 2 decades, with the wall intact, and the report unquestioned, and the new families none the wiser about what lay beneath their houses. But the cover-up also proved something the company never intended to prove, because when powerful men go to the trouble of burying something, it usually means the thing they're burying is real. You don't build a concrete wall across a cave-in, and you don't file a false report with the state inspector over a geological curiosity, and you don't evict your entire workforce and replace them with strangers because of echoes and furnace drafts. You do those things because you're afraid of what might happen if people find out what's really there. And that kind of fear, the kind that makes a coal company seal its own mine rather than let the truth get out, is the most honest thing in this story. The sealed entrance is still out there in the mountains of southern West Virginia, overgrown and forgotten and holding back whatever is on the other side. And the wall stands. And on still nights, when the wind comes down off the ridges and the hollows go quiet the way they do in that part of the world, some say you can hear something if you press your ear against the stone. Not knocking, speaking. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, and share it with someone who knows what the mountains keep.